Welcome to Bedtime Express, your nightly journey into the realm of peaceful dreams and restful slumber. I'm your narrator for tonight's magical voyage through ancient legends and timeless tales. Tonight, we're traveling back to the very dawn of civilization, to the mystical hills of ancient Italy. There, we'll discover the extraordinary story of Romulus and Remus, the wolf-born twins whose destiny shaped the greatest empire the world has ever known. Over the next 3 hours, we'll follow their incredible journey from divine birth through their tragic founding of the eternal city of Rome. If you find comfort in these gentle stories that carry you toward peaceful sleep, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more soothing tales delivered right to your bedside. Your support helps us continue creating these dreamy escapes from the busy world. Now, make yourself completely comfortable. Adjust your pillows, dim the lights, and let your breathing slow and deepen. Close your eyes when you're ready, and allow yourself to drift away on this ancient tale of heroes, legends, and the birth of an eternal city. Our story begins in a time when gods walked among mortals and magic flowed through the world like morning mist. Let the gentle rhythm of these ancient words carry you into the peaceful realm of dreams. Romulus and Remus, the wolf-born kings. In the ancient city of Alba Longa, where marble columns caught the first light of dawn like fingers reaching toward the heavens, there lived a princess whose beauty rivaled that of the morning star. Her name was Rhea Silvia, and she moved through the sacred halls with the grace of a swan gliding across still waters. The daughter of King Numitor, she had been chosen for a destiny that seemed at first glance to deny her the joys of mortal love. The Temple of Vesta stood at the heart of Alba Longa, its circular walls embracing an eternal flame that had burned since time immemorial. This sacred fire was tended by virgin priestesses, women who had dedicated their lives to the goddess of hearth and home. Rhea Silvia, with her raven black hair and eyes like pools of midnight, had taken the sacred vows, binding herself to 30 years of chaste service. Her days were spent in quiet contemplation, feeding the holy flames with precious woods and oils, her nights in prayer beneath the star-studded sky. But the gods, in their infinite wisdom and mysterious ways, had woven a different thread into the tapestry of her fate. For it was not the will of heaven that she should remain forever untouched by love, but rather that her love should be divine, her children destined to shape the very foundations of the world. The marble floors of the temple were cool beneath Rhea Silvia's bare feet as she moved in the pre-dawn darkness, her white robes rustling like whispered prayers. 0, 5. The sacred flame danced before her, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own, and in those flickering patterns, She sometimes glimpsed visions of a future she could not yet understand. The goddess Vesta spoke to her chosen ones, not in words, but in dreams and signs, in the way the flame leaned toward the east or the west, in the color of the smoke that rose toward the celestial realm. On a night when the moon hung full and silver in the velvety darkness, when the very air seemed thick with magic and possibility, Mars, the god of war, looked down from his celestial throne and beheld the beauty of Rhea Silvia. His heart, which had known only the fierce joy of battle and the clash of bronze on bronze, was suddenly filled with a tenderness as soft as morning dew. The god who commanded armies and stirred the hearts of warriors to courage found himself conquered by love for a mortal priestess whose very vows forbade what his divine heart desired. Mars was not a god to be denied, yet neither was he cruel or thoughtless in his passion. He understood the sacred nature of Rhea Silvia's vows, the weight of duty that rested upon her slender shoulders, and so he came to her not as a conqueror, but as a dream, appearing in her sleep when the temple lay quiet and the eternal flame burned low and gentle. In her dreams, Rhea Silvia found herself walking through fields of golden grain that swayed in a warm breeze that carried the scent of wild roses and honey. The sky above was the deep blue of lapis lazuli, unmarred by cloud or shadow, and before her stood a figure of such magnificent beauty that her dream heart trembled with recognition. He wore armor that gleamed like the surface of a still lake at sunset, and his eyes held the depth of eternity itself. His voice, when he spoke, was like the rumble of distant thunder, gentle yet powerful enough to shake the foundations of the earth. Beloved daughter of Earth, Mars spoke in her dream, his words flowing over her like warm wine. You have served the sacred flame with such devotion that even the gods take notice. Your purity of heart, your dedication to the divine, these have not gone unnoticed in the halls of Olympus. I come to you not to break your vows, but to fulfill a destiny that was written in the stars before you drew your first breath. Night after night, the god visited her dreams, and with each visit, their love grew deeper and more profound. It was a love that transcended the boundaries between mortal and divine, a connection that seemed to have existed since the very dawn of creation. And though Rhea Silvia maintained her sacred duties by day, tending the eternal flame with the same devotion she had always shown, her nights were filled with a joy so complete that she seemed to glow with inner light. As the seasons turned and the olive trees in the temple gardens bloomed with tiny white flowers that filled the air with their sweet perfume, Rhea Silvia discovered that her divine love had blessed her with a gift beyond all earthly treasures. Within her womb, 2 souls had been planted like seeds of destiny, 2 lives that would grow to change the very course of history. The realization came to her gradually, like the slow lightening of the sky before dawn, and with it came both joy and fear. She kept her secret hidden beneath her flowing robes, moving through her temple duties with the same serene grace she had always possessed. But those who looked closely might have noticed the new radiance in her dark eyes, the way she seemed to float rather than walk across the polished marble floors. The eternal flame itself seemed to burn brighter in her presence, as if sensing the divine life growing within her. The months passed like a gentle river flowing toward the sea, and Rhea Silvia spent her days in quiet preparation for the miracle that was to come. She would sit beside the sacred pool in the temple's inner garden, watching the golden fish swim in lazy circles, while she placed her hands upon her growing belly and whispered prayers to the gods. Sometimes, in the stillness of those moments, she could swear she felt tiny hands pressing back against her palms, as if her unborn children were already trying to comfort their mother. Mars continued to visit her dreams, his presence now even more tender and protective than before. In her sleep, he would show her visions of the future great cities rising from rolling hills, armies marching beneath banners that bore the symbol of the wolf, aqueducts carrying fresh water across vast distances to nourish the dreams of civilization. "Our sons," he would whisper in the language of dreams, "will be kings and founders, builders of the greatest empire the world has ever known. But first, they must learn the lessons that only hardship can teach, must grow strong in the wild places before they can claim their destiny among men." When the time of birth arrived, it came with the violence of a spring storm, swift and powerful and impossible to ignore. Rhea Silvia had been tending the sacred flame in the pre-dawn hours when the first pangs struck her, doubling her over with their intensity. Yet, even in her pain, she was careful to keep the flame burning bright, for to let it die would bring catastrophe upon all of Alba Longa. The birth took place in secret, in the hidden chambers beneath the temple, where the most sacred artifacts were kept. Only one old priestess, wise in the ways of both divine and mortal mysteries, attended Rhea Silvia as she labored through the long night. The goddess Vesta herself seemed to hover near, her presence filling the chamber with a warmth that had nothing to do with the braziers burning in the corners. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the high windows, Romulus entered the world with a cry that echoed through the stone passages like a battle horn. He was followed moments later by his twin brother Remus, whose voice joined his in a song that seemed to shake the very foundations of the temple. The old priestess gasped as she held the babies up to catch the morning light, for each child bore a mark upon his tiny body, a birthmark in the shape of a wolf's paw, as if Mars himself had claimed them with his touch. Rhea Silvia, exhausted but radiant with maternal joy, held her sons against her breast and felt their tiny hearts beating in perfect rhythm with her own. They were beautiful beyond words, with hair as dark as their mother's and eyes that already seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. When they looked at her, She saw in their infant gazes a recognition that went deeper than mere biology. These were souls she had known across eternity, children of her heart as much as her body. But joy in the divine realm is often shadowed by darkness in the mortal world, and so it was that Rhea Silvia's happiness was soon threatened by the cruel ambition of men. Her uncle Amulius, who had usurped the throne from her father Numitor through treachery and violence, had long feared that his brother's line might one day rise to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. When word reached him of Rhea Silvia's mysterious pregnancy and the birth of twin sons, his paranoid heart filled with a rage as black as midnight. Amulius was a man whose soul had been twisted by power and fear until he saw enemies in every shadow, threats in every innocent face. His spies were everywhere, whispering in corners like poisonous snakes, and it was not long before one of them brought him news that chilled his blood and inflamed his wrath. The virgin priestess, daughter of the rightful king, had given birth to sons who bore the marks of divine favor, and divine favor in the hands of legitimate heirs could topple even the strongest usurper from his stolen throne. The king summoned his most trusted captain, a man whose loyalty had been bought with gold and whose conscience had been silenced by years of carrying out unspeakable orders. "Take the priestess and her bastard sons," Amulius commanded, his voice cold as winter wind through bare branches. "Bind her in chains of iron and cast her into the deepest dungeon, there to remain until death claims her for her broken vows. As for the children," he paused, his cruel eyes glittering in the torchlight, "take them to the river and let the waters claim them. Let no trace remain of Numitor's line to threaten my reign." The soldiers came in the darkest hour before dawn, their bronze armor clanking like the chains of fate as they surrounded the temple of Vesta. Rhea Silvia, holding her precious babies close to her heart, felt the approach of doom like a cold wind through the sacred halls. She had known this moment would come. Mars had warned her in her dreams that the path ahead would be dark and treacherous before it led to glory. As the rough hands of the soldiers seized her, binding her wrists with cruel bonds that cut into her tender flesh, Rhea Silvia looked down at her sons one last time. Romulus gazed up at her with eyes already fierce and proud, while Remus seemed to smile, as if he understood that this parting was not an ending but a beginning. "My beloved children," she whispered, pressing kisses to their tiny foreheads, "though we must part now, know that your mother's love will follow you always. You are sons of Mars, chosen of the gods, and no mortal power can stand against your destiny." The captain, perhaps moved despite himself by the dignity and grace with which Rhea Silvia bore her suffering, took the babies with more gentleness than his orders required. He placed them in a wicker basket lined with the softest wool, and as he lifted them from their mother's arms, he whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening to protect the innocent from the cruelty of men. As the procession made its way through the sleeping city toward the banks of the Tiber, the very elements seemed to rebel against the injustice being done. The wind howled through the narrow streets like a creature in pain, and the stars above flickered as if they too wept for the fate of the divine children. In the distance, wolves could be heard singing their ancient songs to the moon, their voices carrying a note of prophecy that made even the hardened soldiers shiver with unnamed dread. The Tiber River, in that ancient time, flowed with waters that seemed touched by magic, reflecting not just the light of stars and moon, but the hopes and sorrows of all who lived along its banks. It was a river that had witnessed the rise and fall of kings, the tears of mothers, and the laughter of children playing in its shallows during the golden days of summer. On this night, as the captain of Romulus approached its banks with his precious and terrible burden, the river itself seemed to sense that history was about to unfold upon its waters. The captain stood at the water's edge, the wicker basket heavy in his arms, and felt his resolve waver like a candle flame in the wind. Within the basket, the twin babies slept peacefully, their tiny faces serene and beautiful as carved marble, their breath coming in soft, rhythmic sighs that spoke of trust and innocence. How could he, who had once been a father himself before war and loyalty to cruel kings had hardened his heart, cast such perfect creatures into the dark waters? But orders were orders, and the price of disobedience was death not just for himself, but for all his family. With hands that trembled despite his efforts to steady them, he lowered the basket toward the water, whispering a prayer that he hadn't spoken since his own children were small. "Great gods of river and sky," he murmured, "if you have any mercy left in your divine hearts, let these little ones find peace, whether in this world or the next." The basket touched the water with scarcely a ripple, floating as lightly as a lily pad upon the gentle current. The river seemed to embrace it with unusual tenderness, the waters swirling in patterns that defied the natural flow, as if invisible hands were guiding the precious cargo away from the rocky shallows toward deeper, safer channels. The captain watched until the basket disappeared around a bend, then turned away, his duty done but his heart heavier than lead. But the Tiber was no ordinary river, for it flowed through lands blessed by the gods, and had been a witness to divine intervention since the world was young. As the basket bearing Romulus and Remus drifted downstream, the river spirits themselves took notice of the divine children within. These ancient beings, older than memory and wise beyond mortal understanding, recognized the spark of immortal fire that burned within the tiny bodies, the scent of Mars that clung to them like invisible armor. The water beneath the basket began to glow with a soft pearl-like radiance, and fish of every kind swam alongside as if in procession, their scales flashing silver and gold in the mysterious light. Herons and cranes took flight from their roosts along the banks, following the basket's progress with cries that sounded almost like lullabies, while otters dove and played in the wake of the divine cargo, their sleek bodies creating patterns of joy in the moonlit water. As the night wore on and the basket continued its journey, the river began to change its course in subtle ways that only the gods could accomplish. Currents that had flowed in the same direction for centuries suddenly shifted, guiding the basket away from the deep channels where it might have sunk beneath the waves, toward the shallower waters where safety waited. Sandbars that had never existed before rose from the riverbed to form gentle pathways, and fallen logs arranged themselves into natural breakwaters to slow the basket's progress and ensure it would not be swept too far from shore. The twins slept through their miraculous journey, their dreams filled with visions of their divine Father watching over them from his throne among the clouds. Maz himself walked beside them in spirit, his invisible presence calming their hearts and ensuring that no harm would come to his beloved sons. When the current grew too swift, he would slow it with a gesture. When rocks threatened to tear the basket, he would guide it gently around them with the touch of his divine hand. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, the basket came to rest in a shallow cove surrounded by ancient trees whose roots ran deep into the sacred earth. This was a place of power, a grove that had been holy since before the first humans walked the land, where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of the gods was thin as morning mist. The very air seemed to shimmer with magic, and the grass grew greener here than anywhere else along the river's banks. The basket nestled gently against a bed of soft reeds and water lilies, rocking slowly in the lapping waves, as if cradled in loving arms. Above, the branches of a great oak tree spread wide, its leaves rustling with whispers that sounded almost like prayers, while smaller trees, willows and alders, blessed by the water spirits, bent their graceful limbs to form a natural canopy overhead. Flowers bloomed here in profusion despite the early season, their petals falling like snow upon the water to create a carpet of beauty around the floating cradle. It was here, in this place where heaven touched earth, that the first miracle of the twins' mortal lives would unfold. For the sacred grove was not uninhabited, it was home to creatures both wild and wonderful, beings who served as messengers and guardians of the divine will. And among these guardians, none was more noble or more fierce in her protective love than the great she-wolf who had made her den in the heart of the grove. Her name was Lupa, and she was no ordinary wolf, but a creature touched by divine grace and chosen by the gods themselves to serve as guardian of the sacred places. Her coat was silver white like moonlight on fresh snow, and her eyes held depths of wisdom that spoke of centuries spent watching over the boundaries between worlds. She was mother to her own cubs, but her heart was large enough to embrace all creatures in need of protection and love. Lupa had been resting in her den, when the sound of gentle weeping reached her sensitive ears. It was not the harsh crying of distress, but the soft, rhythmic sounds that hungry infants make, and something in those tiny voices called to the deepest instincts of her maternal heart. Rising gracefully from her bed of soft moss and leaves, she padded through the grove on silent feet, her silver form moving like liquid moonlight between the ancient trees. When she reached the water's edge and saw the basket floating among the lilies, her great heart swelled with understanding and purpose. She could smell the scent of Mars upon the babies, could sense the divine fire that burned within their tiny bodies, and she knew without question that these children had been sent to her by the gods themselves. Wading into the warm shallows, she gently took the handle of the basket in her powerful jaws and drew it to shore with infinite care. The twins awoke as their cradle touched dry land, and their eyes already bright with intelligence, despite their tender age fixed upon the magnificent creature who had rescued them from the waters. There was no fear in their gazes, only recognition, as if they understood on some primal level that this silver guardian was their salvation and their destiny. Lupa gazed down at them with eyes full of such love and tenderness that the very air around them seemed to glow with golden light. Lupa's den was a spacious cave carved into the living rock of a hillside, overlooking the sacred grove, its entrance hidden by curtains of flowering vines that filled the air with their sweet perfume. Within, the cave was warm and dry, lined with the softest moss and furnished with beds of leaves and grass that the wolf mother had gathered with her own paws. Crystal springs bubbled up from the rock floor, providing fresh water that tasted of minerals and magic, while shafts of sunlight filtering through cracks in the stone ceiling created patterns of beauty on the walls. Here, Lupa made a nest for the divine twins, weaving together the finest grasses and the softest fur from her own coat to create a bed worthy of the sons of Mars. She laid them down with infinite gentleness, then curled her great body around them in a protective circle, her silver form creating a living wall against all danger. When they cried with hunger, she offered them the nourishment of her own body, and they suckled at her teats as naturally as if they had been born her own cubs. The milk of a divine wolf was no ordinary sustenance, but ambrosia in liquid form, filling the babies not just with physical nourishment, but with strength and courage that would serve them all their lives. As they drank, they grew visibly stronger, their tiny limbs becoming more active, their voices more robust, their eyes brighter with each passing day. And Lupa, watching over them with the fierce devotion of a mother protecting her most precious treasures, knew that she was helping to raise not just children, but future kings. Word of the divine children spread quickly through the sacred grove, carried on the wind by the spirits of the trees, and whispered from bird to bird until all the creatures of the woodland knew of their presence. And one by one, they came to offer their own gifts and protection to the sons of Mars, creating a community of guardians unlike any the world had ever seen. A great red stag, his antlers crowned with 12 points that caught the sunlight like polished bronze, became their sentinel, standing guard at the entrance to the cave and alerting Lupa to any approaching danger with his magnificent bugling call. Eagles soared overhead in endless circles, their keen eyes watching for threats from above, while ravens and crows served as messengers, carrying news of the twins' welfare to the far corners of the divine realm. Bears brought honey in their great paws, their usually fierce faces gentle with wonder as they approached the cave where the godchildren slept. Deer offered the sweetest fruits from the forest, laying them at the cave entrance like gifts upon an altar, while wild boars used their tusks to root up the most tender bulbs and shoots for Lupa to sample and judge, fit for her precious charges. Even the smallest creatures played their part. Mice and squirrels gathered the softest materials for the twins' bedding, while butterflies danced in the air above them, their colorful wings creating patterns of beauty that seemed to bless the children with joy. As Romulus and Remus grew from tiny infants into sturdy toddlers, their education in the sacred grove continued under the watchful eye of their wolf mother. Lupa taught them the ancient wisdom of the wilderness, lessons that no human tutor could have provided, skills that would serve them well in the trials that lay ahead. They learned to move silently through the forest, their feet finding the paths that made no sound even when hurried. They learned to read the signs in the wind and the sky, to know when rain would come or when danger approached by the behavior of birds and beasts. From the great stag, they learned patience and the art of standing perfectly still until they became one with their surroundings. From the eagles, they learned to see with sharp eyes that missed nothing, to spot movement from great distances, to read the landscape like a map written in stone and stream. The bears taught them strength and the knowledge of when to fight and when to flee, while the deer showed them grace and speed, the ability to leap over obstacles that would stop lesser creatures in their tracks. But perhaps most importantly, they learned from Lupa herself the greatest lesson of all, the meaning of loyalty and love that transcends blood. They saw how she would risk her own life without hesitation to protect them, how she shared her food when it was scarce, how she groomed them each night with her rough tongue until they were clean and comfortable. In her fierce devotion, they learned what it meant to be a true leader, not one who commands through fear, but one who inspires through love and earns loyalty through sacrifice. By their third year in the sacred grove, Romulus and Remus had grown into children of remarkable beauty and strength. Their hair remained as dark as their mother's, but now it gleamed with highlights that seemed touched by flame, and their eyes held depths of wisdom that spoke of their divine heritage. They were tall for their age, with limbs that promised great strength when fully grown, and they moved with a natural grace that marked them as different from ordinary children. The birthmarks they had carried since birth, the wolf's paws that Mars had placed upon them, had grown with them, becoming more distinct and beautiful with each passing season. Romulus bore his mark upon his right shoulder, where it showed like a badge of honor against his sun-bronzed skin, while Remus carried his upon his left arm, the mirror image of his brother's sign. When they ran together through the forest, as they did each day at dawn and sunset, these marks seemed to glow with inner fire, as if the god of war himself was watching and approving their progress. They had learned to communicate not just with Lupa, but with all the creatures of the grove, speaking a language older than human words, understanding that went beyond mere sound to touch the very souls of the animals around them. Wolves from neighboring packs would come to pay homage to the divine children, lowering their heads in respect and offering their own strength to the growing community that surrounded the twins. It was clear to all who saw them that these children were destined for greatness, marked by the gods for a purpose that would shake the very foundations of the world. In the rolling hills that surrounded the sacred grove, there lived a shepherd whose heart was as pure as the spring water that bubbled up from the earth. His name was Faustulus, and he was a man who had learned to read the language of the sky and the seasons, whose gentle hands could coax life from the most stubborn soil, whose voice could calm the wildest storm with its quiet strength. He was shepherd to the royal flocks of King Amulius, but his loyalty lay not with earthly power, but with the eternal truths that governed the movements of stars and the changing of seasons. Faustulus was a man of middle years, his hair touched with silver like frost on autumn grass, his face lined with the marks of countless days spent under the open sky. His eyes were the color of deep forest pools, holding depths of kindness that made even the wariest creatures trust him on first sight. He lived simply in a stone cottage that his own hands had built, surrounded by gardens where he grew herbs and vegetables with a skill that bordered on magic. His wife, Acca Laurentia, was a woman of equal virtue, her heart large enough to mother every orphaned creature that found its way to their door. It was Faustulus who first began to notice the strange signs that marked the presence of something divine in the sacred grove. His sheep, usually scattered across the hillsides in search of the sweetest grass, began to gather at the edge of the woodland, standing in peaceful rows as if listening to music only they could hear. The wolves, instead of being the enemies of his flocks, seemed to watch over the sheep with protective eyes, and more than once he had seen the great silver she-wolf moving through his pastures with a regal grace that took his breath away. On a morning when the mist hung low over the valley like a blanket of silver silk, Faustulus set out to check on his most adventurous sheep, a small flock that had wandered closer to the grove than usual. The air was sweet with the scent of wild roses and honeysuckle, and bird song filled the dawn with melodies that seemed almost too beautiful to be of this world. As he walked through the dew-wet grass, his shepherd's staff tapping a gentle rhythm on the earth, he felt as though he were walking through a dream. The sound reached him first, the laughter of children, pure and joyous as water flowing over smooth stones. It was a sound so unexpected in this wild place that he stopped in his tracks, his heart suddenly beating faster with wonder and disbelief. Following the sound through the trees, pushing aside curtains of flowering vines with gentle hands, he came upon a sight that would remain burned into his memory for the rest of his mortal days. In a clearing dappled with golden sunlight, 2 boys of perhaps 5 years were playing with a pack of wolves as if they were tame as household dogs. The children were beautiful beyond description, their dark hair gleaming like polished obsidian, their skin bronzed by sun and wind, their bodies strong and graceful as young deer. They moved among the wolves with perfect confidence, their laughter ringing out like silver bells as they wrestled and played with creatures that could have torn them apart with a single snap of powerful jaws. But it was the great she-wolf at the center of the pack that made Faustulus's breath catch in his throat. She was magnificent, her silver coat gleaming like moonlight, her eyes holding depths of wisdom that spoke of divine origin. And the way she looked at the children with such fierce love and protective devotion told him immediately that these were no ordinary orphans, but beings touched by the gods themselves. Faustulus stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, afraid to breathe lest he break the spell of the magical scene before him. As he watched, one of the boys, the one with a peculiar mark upon his right shoulder that looked remarkably like a wolf's paw, suddenly turned and looked directly at him with eyes that seemed older than his young face. There was no fear in that gaze, no surprise at being discovered, only a calm recognition that spoke of wisdom far beyond mortal years. The great she-wolf raised her magnificent head and fixed Faustulus with a stare that seemed to see straight through to his soul. For a moment that stretched into eternity, shepherd and wolf regarded each other across the sun-dappled clearing, and in that silent exchange, understanding passed between them like lightning leaping from cloud to earth. The wolf knew that this man was different from others, that his heart held no malice, no fear, only wonder and a deep respect for the mysteries of the divine world. Slowly, with movements as careful as morning dew forming on flower petals, Faustulus stepped into the clearing. The wolves made no move to attack him, but rather parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, creating a clear path to where the children stood watching him with curious, intelligent eyes. As he drew nearer, he could see more clearly the marks of divine favor upon them, not just the wolf's paw birthmarks, but an aura of golden light that seemed to surround them like a gentle flame. "Who are you, little lords?" Faustulus asked in a voice soft as summer rain, dropping to one knee so that he might meet their eyes on the same level. "And how come you to dwell in this sacred place with such noble guardians?" The boy with the mark on his shoulder, who would later be known as Romulus, stepped forward with a confidence that belonged to born kings. "We are the sons of the Silver Mother," he said, his young voice clear and strong as a mountain stream. "She found us by the great water and brought us to her home in the hill. The forest creatures are our family, and the wind itself teaches us its secrets." His twin brother, Remus, moved to stand beside him, and Faustulus could see that while they were clearly siblings, each possessed his own unique character. Where Romulus stood straight and proud as a young oak tree, Remus seemed to flow like water, his movements graceful and fluid, his smile holding a warmth that could melt winter ice. "The great mother wolf has shown us many things," Remus added, his voice melodious as birdsong at dawn. "We know the names of all the stars and can speak with creatures that have no words, but we have never seen one like you before." Faustulus felt his heart swell with a mixture of awe and protective love as he looked upon these divine children. In their faces, he could see echoes of nobility that spoke of royal blood, and in their bearing, the unconscious confidence of those born to command. Yet there was also something heartbreakingly vulnerable about them. They were children still, despite their otherworldly wisdom, and they needed the care and guidance that only mortal love could provide. "You are indeed blessed by the gods," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion, "and your Silver Mother has cared for you with a love deeper than the ocean itself. But tell me, young princes, do you not sometimes wonder about the world beyond this sacred grove? About other children who laugh and play as you do? About the cities where men build great towers that reach toward the sky?" The twins exchanged a glance that spoke of the deep connection between them, that silent communication that only true twins possess. In that look, Faustulus saw longing, not dissatisfaction with their wild home, but curiosity about the larger world that called to their royal souls. Lupa, sensing the direction of the conversation, rose gracefully from her resting place and padded over to the shepherd with steps as silent as falling snow. To Faustulus's amazement, the great she-wolf bowed her magnificent head to him, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement that left him breathless with wonder. Then, in a voice that seemed to speak directly to his mind rather than his ears, she communicated her thoughts to him. "The time has come," her mental voice was like silver bells chiming in a distant temple, "for my beloved cubs to learn the ways of their birth kind. I have taught them all that the wild can offer, but they must know both worlds if they are to fulfill their destiny. You, faithful shepherd, have been chosen to guide them in this next phase of their journey." Faustulus felt the weight of divine responsibility settle upon his shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight itself. He understood that this was no chance encounter, but a moment planned by the gods from the very beginning of time. His humble cottage, his patient wife, his simple life as a shepherd, all of it had been preparation for this sacred trust. I am honored beyond words," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. "But how can I, a simple keeper of sheep, provide for such extraordinary children? What wisdom do I possess that could possibly guide the sons of gods?" Lupa's mental voice came again, filled with warmth and reassurance. "You possess the greatest wisdom of all, a heart that knows how to love without condition, hands that know how to work without complaint, and a spirit that recognizes truth in all its forms. These boys need to learn that greatness comes not from divine blood alone, but from the choices one makes, the compassion one shows, the loyalty one gives. Who better to teach them these lessons than one who lives them every day?" The twins, who had been listening to this exchange with the serene attention of those accustomed to witnessing miracles, stepped forward together. Romulus placed his small hand on Faustulus's weathered palm, and the shepherd felt a warmth flow through him like sunshine breaking through clouds. "We would be honored to learn from you, gentle shepherd," the boy said, with a formality that would have seemed strange in one so young, if not for the divine dignity that surrounded him like invisible light. Remus nodded his agreement, his smile bright as morning stars. "Our silver mother has taught us to trust those whose hearts are pure," he added, "and we can see that your heart shines like crystal touched by moonlight. Will you show us the world of men and help us understand our place within it?" What followed was a farewell ceremony unlike any the world had ever witnessed. The creatures of the sacred grove gathered in the clearing as word spread through the woodland that their beloved princes were about to embark on a new chapter of their journey. The great red stag came first, his antlers gleaming like polished bronze in the morning sun, followed by the eagles who circled overhead with cries that sounded like hymns of blessing. Bears emerged from their dens carrying gifts of honey and sweet berries, while deer brought the finest fruits the forest could offer. Even the smallest creatures participated: rabbits and squirrels, mice and songbirds, all gathering to bid farewell to the children who had brought such joy and wonder to their woodland world. The very trees seemed to bend their branches in salute, their leaves rustling with whispers that sounded like prayers for safe journey. Lupa stood at the center of this magical gathering, her silver coat gleaming like armor forged from moonbeams, her eyes bright with love and pride and just a touch of sorrow. She had raised these children from helpless infants to strong, wise boys, had protected them through dangers both seen and unseen, had poured her very soul into their upbringing. Now she must trust them to another's care, must watch them walk away from the only home they had ever known. But she was a mother in the truest sense, and she knew that love sometimes means letting go, even when every instinct screams to hold tight. She approached each twin in turn, nuzzling them gently with her great muzzle, breathing in their scent one last time, imprinting their beloved faces forever in her memory. When she spoke to them, it was in the silent language they had shared since infancy, words of love and wisdom that would remain with them always. Remember always that you are children of two worlds, her voice echoed in their minds like a gentle song. The wild has made you strong and taught you wisdom, but the world of men will teach you different lessons of justice and mercy, of leadership and sacrifice. Carry the fierce loyalty of the wolf in your hearts, but temper it with human compassion. And know that no matter how far you travel or how high you rise, you will always be my beloved cubs, and this sacred grove will always be your first home. Faustulus led the twins away from the sacred grove as the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, painting the world in shades of gold and amber that seemed to bless their journey. The boys walked beside him with the easy grace of those accustomed to long travels, though Faustulus noticed how often they turned to look back at the woodland they were leaving, their eyes bright with unshed tears. The path to the shepherd's cottage wound through hills covered with wildflowers that seemed to bloom more brightly in the presence of the divine children. Bees hummed lazy songs as they moved from blossom to blossom, and butterflies danced in the air around the walking figures like tiny fragments of rainbow given life. The very earth seemed to celebrate their passage, grass growing greener where their feet touched the ground, streams running clearer as they knelt to drink. As they walked, Faustulus began the first of many conversations that would shape the twins' understanding of the mortal world. He spoke of kings and shepherds, of the mighty and the humble, of how true worth was measured not in gold or power, but in the kindness shown to those in need. He told them stories of heroes from ages past, of men who had risen from humble beginnings to achieve greatness through courage and wisdom and love. The twins listened with the rapt attention of those hungry for knowledge, asking questions that revealed minds already sharp as polished steel. They wanted to know about justice and how it differed from revenge, about leadership and how it could serve rather than dominate, about the delicate balance between strength and mercy that marked all truly great rulers. Their questions revealed souls that had been touched by divinity, but still needed to learn the complexities of mortal existence. Acca Laurentia was working in her garden when she first saw her husband approaching with his extraordinary companions. She was a woman whose beauty came not from youth, for she had seen 40 summers, but from the inner radiance that comes from a life spent in service to others. Her hair was the color of ripe wheat, streaked with silver that caught the sunlight like threads of precious metal, and her eyes held the warm brown depths of earth after rain. When she looked up from her herbs and saw the 3 figures approaching, her heart stopped for just a moment before beginning to beat with a rhythm that seemed to match the very pulse of the earth itself. The children walking beside her beloved husband were so beautiful that they seemed to glow with inner light, and she knew without needing to be told that these were no ordinary foundlings, but beings touched by the divine hand of destiny. "Husband," she called out, her voice musical as a lark's song at dawn, "what treasures have you brought home to brighten our humble dwelling?" Faustulus smiled, his weathered face creasing with joy and pride as he gestured to the twins. "Beloved wife, I bring you 2 sons who have been sent to us by the gods themselves. Their names are Romulus and Remus, and they have been raised in the sacred grove by the great she-wolf until this day. The divine powers have entrusted them to our care, that we might teach them the ways of mortal folk and prepare them for the greatness that awaits." Laurentia looked into the faces of the twin boys and saw there the mingled nobility and innocence that marked all true princes. Her motherly heart, which had yearned for children of her own through all the years of her marriage, opened like a flower greeting the morning sun. She knelt before the twins, her hands extended in welcome, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "Welcome to our home, dear children," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Though these walls are simple stone and this roof is humble thatch, they shelter hearts that will love you as our own, hands that will work tirelessly for your welfare, and souls that will rejoice in your every triumph." The cottage of Faustulus and Laurentia became a school where the divine twins learned lessons that no palace could have taught them. They learned to work with their hands, helping Faustulus tend his flocks and mend the stone walls that kept the sheep safe from predators. Under the patient guidance of Laurentia, they discovered the arts of the hearth, how to bake bread that nourished both body and soul, how to weave cloth from the wool of their guardian's sheep, how to tend a garden so that it yielded abundance for all who had need. But perhaps most importantly, they learned about the dignity of honest labor and the joy that comes from work done well. Faustulus showed them that there was no shame in any task performed with care and dedication, whether it was mucking out a sheepfold or standing guard through the long watches of the night. A true king, he would tell them as they worked side by side in the fields, is one who understands the labors of his people, who has felt the ache of tired muscles and the satisfaction of a job well done. Only then can he rule with wisdom and compassion. The twins threw themselves into their new life with the same enthusiasm they had shown for their wild games in the sacred grove. They learned quickly, their divine touched minds grasping concepts that would have taken ordinary children years to master. But more than their intelligence, it was their humility and willingness to serve that impressed their adoptive parents. They never complained about the hardest tasks, never acted as though they were above the simplest chores, never failed to show gratitude for the lessons they were taught. As the months passed and the twins grew from boys into young men, their reputation began to spread throughout the hills and valleys around their humble home. Travelers who stopped at the shepherd's cottage to rest and water their animals went away with tales of the 2 brothers whose kindness knew no bounds, whose strength could move the largest stones, whose wisdom seemed touched by the gods themselves. Merchants told stories of how the young men had helped them rescue their goods from bandits, asking nothing in return but the satisfaction of seeing justice done. Farmers spoke of how Romulus and Remus had worked through the night to help save a harvest threatened by early frost, their efforts ensuring that no family would go hungry in the winter months. Pilgrims returning from distant temples whispered of the mysterious light that seemed to surround the brothers when they performed acts of particular kindness or courage. The twins had grown tall and strong, their bodies hardened by honest work and their minds sharpened by constant learning. Romulus had developed into a natural leader, his voice commanding respect even from men twice his age, his bearing that of one born to rule empires. Yet there was nothing arrogant about his confidence. It was the quiet assurance of one who knows his own worth without needing to diminish others. Remus, while equally impressive in his own way, showed a different aspect of leadership, the ability to inspire through compassion and understanding rather than command. He had a gift for seeing the good in everyone he met, for finding solutions that served all parties rather than favoring one over another. Where Romulus might solve a problem with decisive action, Remus would seek a path that brought harmony and healing to all involved. Together, they made a formidable team, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. They were known throughout the region as young men who could be trusted absolutely, whose word was as solid as the mountains themselves, whose loyalty once given would never waver. And though they had no idea of their true parentage or royal destiny, they carried themselves with a natural nobility that marked them as different from their peers. As Romulus and Remus grew into their strength and wisdom, the shadow of King Amulius's tyranny continued to darken the lands around Alba Longa. The usurper's rule had grown ever more oppressive with each passing year, his paranoia driving him to acts of cruelty that made even his closest allies question their loyalty. Taxes ground the people into poverty, while the king's guards seized property and persons at will, answering to no law but their master's whims. The twins had reached their 18th year when fate began to weave the threads that would lead them back toward their destiny. They had grown into magnificent young men, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that blazed with the fire of their divine father and hearts that burned with passion for justice. Their reputations as protectors of the innocent had spread far beyond their humble valley, drawing the attention of both friends and enemies. It was during the festival of Robigalia, when the people gathered to pray for protection of their crops from blight, that the first direct confrontation occurred. The twins had come to the celebration with a group of local shepherds and farmers, their presence adding to the general atmosphere of joy and hope that such festivals typically brought. They moved through the crowd with easy grace, their natural charisma drawing people to them like iron filings to a lodestone. But the festival was disrupted by the arrival of Romulus' tax collectors, men whose hearts had been hardened by years of serving a tyrant's greed. They came with armed guards and demands for tribute that would have left many families destitute, their cruel laughter echoing across the holy ground as they seized the festival offerings that were meant for the gods. Romulus was the first to step forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a sword through silk. "By what right do you defile this sacred place with your greed?" he demanded, his tall frame radiating an authority that made even the armed guards step back in unconscious respect. These offerings were given freely to honor the gods, not to line the coffers of a tyrant who has forgotten the meaning of justice. The head tax collector, a man whose face bore the marks of every cruel act he had ever committed, sneered at the young challenger. "And who are you, shepherd boy, to question the will of King Romulus? Stand aside or feel the weight of royal justice upon your impudent head." Remus moved to stand beside his brother, his presence doubling the sense of power that emanated from the twins. "True justice," he said in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the gathered crowd, "protects the weak and punishes only the guilty. What you practice is not justice but theft, sanctified by the empty title of a king who stole his throne through treachery and murder." A murmur ran through the assembled people, a sound like wind through wheat fields, as they realized that someone had finally dared to speak the truths that had lived only in their hearts for so many years. The twins stood like twin oaks in a storm, unmoved by the threats and bluster of the tax collectors, their courage giving strength to all who witnessed their stand. What followed was a battle that would be remembered in song and story for generations to come. The tax collectors, emboldened by their superior numbers and weapons, made the fatal mistake of underestimating opponents whose veins carried the blood of Mars himself. When the first god raised his sword against Romulus, the young man moved with speed that seemed supernatural, disarming his attacker with a grace that turned violence into a form of deadly dance. Remus fought with equal skill but different style, his movements flowing like water around stone, redirecting his enemies' attacks until they found themselves striking each other instead of their intended target. The brothers moved as one, their years of training in the wild serving them well as they transformed the festival ground into a battlefield where justice warred against oppression. The people, inspired by the courage of the twins, began to find their own strength. Farmers who had been cowed into submission for years suddenly remembered what it felt like to stand tall. Shepherds who had accepted abuse as the natural order of things discovered they could fight back. The festival ground erupted into chaos as the long-suppressed anger of the oppressed finally found its voice in action. When the dust settled and the last of the tax collectors had fled in terror, Romulus and Remus stood victorious among their people, their clothes torn and bloodied, but their spirits soaring with the joy of righteous triumph. The crowd that surrounded them was no longer a collection of frightened peasants, but the beginning of an army united by a common cause and inspired by leaders worthy of their loyalty. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire through the countryside, carried by travelers and merchants who had witnessed the twins' incredible display of courage and skill. Within days, people were making pilgrimages to the humble cottage of Faustulus and Acca Larentia, seeking an audience with the young heroes who had dared to stand against the tyrant king. They came from every corner of the realm: farmers whose lands had been seized, merchants ruined by excessive taxes, soldiers disgusted by the orders they were forced to carry out. Each had their own story of suffering under Amulius's rule, but all shared the same desperate hope that perhaps, at last, someone had arisen who could lead them to freedom. The twins listened to each supplicant with patience and compassion, their hearts breaking at the tales of injustice and cruelty they heard. But they also saw in these desperate people the raw material of something greater, a force that, properly led and inspired, could sweep away the corruption that had poisoned their land for so many years. Brothers and sisters, Romulus addressed a gathering of several hundred followers who had camped in the hills around their home. We have all felt the weight of the tyrant's boot upon our necks, all tasted the bitter bread of oppression. But I tell you this, the gods have not abandoned us, nor have they left us defenseless against those who would grind us into the dust. The time has come to stand together, to show Amulius and all who serve him that free people will not bow forever to unjust rule. Remus stepped forward, his voice adding harmony to his brother's martial tone. Yet let us not become what we fight against, he counseled, his words carrying the wisdom of one who understood that the means must be worthy of the end. We seek not conquest but justice, not revenge but restoration of the natural order. Our cause is righteous, and righteousness must be our shield and our sword in the battles that lie ahead. It was in the midst of these preparations for what would clearly become open rebellion that fate chose to reveal the greatest secret of all. Faustulus had watched with growing wonder and concern as his adopted sons gathered an army around them, their natural leadership abilities drawing followers like honey draws bees. He knew the time had come to share the knowledge he had carried in his heart for so many years, the truth of their divine parentage and royal blood. On a night when the moon hung full and silver in the star-studded sky, the old shepherd drew the twins aside to a quiet place where they could speak without being overheard. The air was sweet with the scent of night-blooming flowers, and somewhere in the distance a nightingale sang melodies that seemed to carry messages from the realm of the gods. "My beloved sons," Faustulus began, his voice heavy with emotion and the weight of long-kept secrets, "the time has come for you to know the full truth of your heritage. You are not merely foundlings blessed by the gods, but princes of the blood, rightful heirs to the throne that Romulus has defiled with his presence. He told them the story their mother Rhea Silvia, of her divine union with Mars, of their miraculous birth, and the cruel orders that had sent them floating down the sacred river. He spoke of Lupa's rescue, of their years in the sacred grove, of the signs and portents that had marked their journey from divine infants to the leaders they had become. Every word fell upon their ears like drops of liquid fire, burning away the last veils of ignorance and revealing the blazing truth of their destiny. Your grandfather, Numitor, Faustulus continued, lives still, though imprisoned by his brother's treachery. Your mother, Rhea Silvia, languishes in Romulus's dungeons, condemned for bringing forth the children who were destined to reclaim their birthright. The blood of kings flows in your veins, but more than that, the blessing of Mars himself has marked you for greatness that will echo through all the ages of the world. The revelation struck the twins like lightning from a clear sky, illuminating in an instant the true meaning of all they had experienced and accomplished. Suddenly, their natural authority made sense, their ability to inspire loyalty in others, their instinctive understanding of justice and leadership. They were not merely gifted individuals fighting against tyranny, they were the rightful heirs to a throne, sons of a god, destined from birth to reshape the very foundations of the world. Romulus stood silent for a long moment, his face turned toward the star-filled sky where his divine father watched from his celestial throne. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new note of authority, the unmistakable ring of one who has finally understood his true calling. Then all of this has been preparation, he said slowly, each word weighted with the gravity of destiny. Our years in the sacred grove, our time learning the ways of simple folk, the gathering of loyal followers, all of it leading to this moment of revelation and choice. Remus nodded, his own face grave with the understanding of what lay before them. We cannot turn away from this knowledge, cannot pretend we are still merely shepherds fighting for justice. The blood of our grandfather cries out for vengeance, our mother's suffering demands rescue, and our people's oppression requires the leadership that only rightful rulers can provide. But even as they accepted the weight of their destiny, both brothers felt the bittersweet pang of loss for the simpler life they were leaving behind. No longer could they be merely Romulus and Remus, beloved sons of humble shepherds, protectors of their small community. They were princes now, with all the responsibilities and sacrifices that royal blood demanded. The army that marched toward Alba Longa in the weeks that followed was unlike any that had been seen in those lands for generations. It was not a force of conquest driven by greed or ambition, but a righteous host united by a common cause and led by princes whose very presence seemed to radiate divine approval. Shepherds marched beside farmers, craftsmen walked with soldiers who had abandoned the tyrant's service, all bound together by their faith in the twin leaders who had shown them that freedom was not just a dream, but an achievable goal. The march itself became a thing of legend, as the army's passage was marked by signs and wonders that convinced even the most skeptical that the gods themselves had blessed this endeavor. Springs of fresh water bubbled up from the earth wherever the host made camp, providing pure drink for men and animals alike. Wild game seemed to offer itself willingly to the hunters, ensuring that no one went hungry despite the army's size. Most remarkably, the weather remained fair and mild, as if Mars himself was smoothing the path for his beloved sons. As word of their approach spread, Amulius's supporters began to desert in increasing numbers, their loyalty to the usurper crumbling in the face of an alternative that offered both legitimacy and hope. Many of them had served the tyrant not from conviction but from fear, and the sight of an army led by rightful princes gave them the courage to remember where their true loyalties should lie. The twins rode at the head of their host on horses that seemed to dance rather than gallop, their manes and tails flowing like liquid silver in the morning light. Romulus carried a spear that had been blessed by the priests of Mars, its point gleaming with an inner fire that never dimmed, while Remus bore a shield decorated with the image of the she-wolf who had nurtured them, her silver form seeming to move and breathe in the shifting patterns of the polished bronze. Alba Longa, when it finally came into view, stood like a challenge against the morning sky, its high walls and towers speaking of strength that had been turned to oppression rather than protection. The city that should have been a beacon of justice and prosperity had become a fortress of fear, its gates barred against the very people it was meant to serve. But the sight of those forbidding walls only strengthened the resolve of the approaching army. These were people who had lived under the shadow of those towers for too long, who had paid tribute to a king who had forgotten that true power comes from the consent of the governed rather than the fear of the oppressed. Now, at last, they had leaders worthy of their loyalty and a cause that justified any sacrifice. The siege that followed was as much a battle of hearts and minds as it was a contest of military strength. The twins made it clear from the beginning that their quarrel was not with the common soldiers who manned the walls, but with the system of tyranny that had corrupted the natural order of things. They offered amnesty to any who would abandon Amulius's cause, promising positions of honor in the new order they intended to establish. Day by day, the defenders grew fewer, as more and more of them chose to open the gates from within, rather than continue fighting for a cause they could no longer believe in. The twins' reputation for mercy and justice had preceded them, and many who might have fought to the death for a worthy cause found they had no heart to die for a tyrant who had brought nothing but misery to the land. When the final assault came, it was swift and decisive. The gates of Alba Longa opened not to battering rams and siege engines, but to the righteous anger of a people finally freed from fear. Romulus and Remus led the charge through the streets of the city, their divine heritage blazing around them like visible flame, their voices raised in battle cries that echoed their father Mars's own war songs. Amulius waited in his throne room like a cornered beast, surrounded by the few guards who remained loyal to him out of greed or desperation. The usurper king had aged badly during his years of paranoid rule, his face twisted by cruelty and fear into something barely human. When the great doors burst open and the twin princes strode into the hall, their presence seemed to fill the vast space with light that made the shadows flee into the farthest corners. "So," Amulius snarled, his voice cracking with the strain of terror barely held in check, "the bastard spawn of the virgin priestess have finally come to claim what they think is theirs. Did you think I wouldn't recognize you despite all the years? Did you think your wolf mother's milk could wash away the stain of your illegitimate birth?" Romulus stepped forward, his spear gleaming in his hand like a shaft of captured sunlight. "We are the sons of Mars and the grandsons of Numitor, the rightful king whose throne you stole through treachery and murder. Our birth was blessed by the gods themselves, and our legitimacy needs no defense from the likes of you." Remus moved to flank the tyrant, his shield raised and ready, his voice carrying the authority of divine judgment. "Where is our mother, Rhea Silvia? Where is our grandfather Numitor? 05. Account for the innocent blood you have spilled, and perhaps the gods will show you more mercy than you showed them." The battle that followed was brief but terrible in its intensity. Amulius fought with the desperate fury of one who knows his doom is sealed, his sword flashing like silver lightning as he tried to carve a path through enemies who seemed protected by divine armor. But no mortal skill could stand against the sons of Mars when their righteous anger was fully aroused. Romulus's spear found its mark with unerring accuracy, piercing the tyrant's heart with a thrust that carried not just physical force, but the weight of divine justice. As Amulius fell, his crown rolling across the marble floor with a sound like distant thunder, the oppression that had weighed upon the land for so many years seemed to lift like morning mist before the rising sun. The remaining gods threw down their weapons and begged for mercy, which the twins granted with a magnanimity that showed their divine nature more clearly than any miracle could have done. They had come not to slaughter, but to restore justice, not to rule through fear, but to lead through love and wisdom earned through suffering. The liberation of the royal prisoners was a scene that moved even the hardest hearts to tears of joy. Numitor, their grandfather, emerged from his dungeon cell bent with age and suffering, but with eyes that still blazed with the fire of a true king. When he looked upon his grandsons for the first time, he saw in their faces the echo of his own youth, the noble bearing that no amount of hardship could completely break. "My sons," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he embraced them both. "The gods have answered prayers I had almost stopped believing they could hear. You have your mother's beauty and your divine father's strength, but more than that, you have the wisdom that comes only from understanding both suffering and joy, both humble service and divine destiny. The reunion with Rhea Silvia was even more poignant, for she had never stopped believing that her children lived and would one day return to claim their heritage. Though the years of imprisonment had aged her beyond her mortal span, her beauty remained undimmed, shining now with the radiance of a mother's love vindicated and a priestess's faith rewarded. "My beloved boys," she wept as she held them close, her tears washing away years of sorrow and fear. "I felt your presence even in the darkest hours, knew that the wolf mother who saved you would raise you to be worthy of your divine father's love. Mars has kept his promise. You are indeed kings and founders, builders of something greater than any kingdom that has come before." With Romulus dead and the rightful royal family restored, the question arose of who would rule Alba Longa. The people, united in their gratitude to the twin liberators, clamored for both brothers to share the throne, their loyalty divided equally between the two heroes who had delivered them from tyranny. But Romulus and Remus, wise beyond their years, understood that divided leadership often leads to divided loyalty and eventual conflict. In a great assembly held in the main square of Alba Longa, with thousands gathered to witness the momentous decision, the twins stood together before their people and their grandfather. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble stones, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath as the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance. "Beloved grandfather," Romulus spoke first, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the square. "We return to you the throne that was stolen from your hands. You are the rightful king of Alba Longa, and we are content to serve as your heirs and defenders until the gods call you to join them in the eternal realm." Numita smiled, his weathered face creasing with pride and love as he looked upon his grandsons. "My dear boys, you have already proven yourselves worthy of any crown, but I see in your eyes the hunger for something greater than the rule of a single city. The gods have marked you for a different destiny, one that will echo through all the ages of the world." That night, as the celebrations of liberation continued in the streets below, Romulus and Remus climbed to the highest tower of the royal palace to seek guidance in prayer and meditation. The night was clear and warm, with stars that seemed to burn more brightly than usual, and the moon hung like a silver shield in the velvet darkness. As they knelt in prayer to their divine father, Mars himself appeared before them in a vision more vivid than any dream. The god stood in glory that would have blinded mortal eyes, but his sons looked upon him without fear, their own divine heritage protecting them from the overwhelming radiance of pure deity. "My beloved children," Mars spoke, his voice like the sound of armies on the march, and yet tender as a father's lullaby. "You have fulfilled the first part of your destiny by restoring justice to Alba Longa. But greater tasks await you, challenges that will test not just your courage and wisdom, but the strength of the bond between you. The god gestured toward the western hills, where the Tiber River wound its way toward the sea like a silver serpent in the moonlight. There, where 7 hills rise from the river plain, you will build a city that will become the greatest the world has ever known. Rome will be its name, and Roman will be the title worn with pride by countless generations of your descendants. But first, you must choose which of you will be the founder, which will rule and which will serve, which will give his name to the eternal city. The vision faded like morning mist, leaving the twins alone on the tower with the weight of their father's words heavy upon their hearts. For the first time in their lives, they faced a choice that could not be shared, a destiny that could only belong to one of them. The foundation of Rome would require a single leader, a single vision, a single name to carry forward through history. In the days that followed, as they made preparations to leave Alba Longa and seek the site of their future city, the twins found themselves grappling with emotions they had never experienced before. Competition began to creep into conversations that had once been marked only by harmony. Each brother began to see in the other not just a beloved sibling, but a rival for the greatest prize destiny could offer. Their followers, sensing the tension between their leaders, began to divide into factions. Some favored Romulus for his bold leadership and decisive action, while others preferred Remus for his wisdom and compassionate nature. What had once been a united movement began to split along lines of loyalty and preference, creating the conditions for a conflict that would test the very foundations of their brotherhood. The departure from Alba Longa was marked by ceremonies that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality around them. Priests from every temple in the city came to bless the expedition, their chants rising toward the heavens like prayers given voice, while sacred fires burned continuously to light the way for the chosen founders. The twins rode at the head of their combined host, but those who looked closely might have noticed that they no longer rode side by side as they once had, but with a subtle distance between them that spoke of growing tensions. The journey westward toward the 7 hills took them through countryside that seemed to recognize their divine nature. Rivers ran clearer in their presence, fields bloomed with unseasonable abundance, and wild creatures gathered along their route as if drawn by some primal understanding that these were no ordinary mortals passing through their domain. Yet for all the signs of divine favor, the atmosphere within the expedition grew more strained with each passing day. The followers of the twins began to separate into distinct camps, their loyalties crystallizing around one brother or the other as the question of leadership became more pressing. Those who favored Romulus admired his strength and decisiveness, his ability to make quick decisions and inspire immediate action. The supporters of Remus were drawn to his wisdom and fairness, his gift for finding solutions that served everyone rather than just the powerful. Arguments began to break out around the campfires each evening, passionate debates about which brother was better suited to lead the great enterprise that lay ahead. The twins themselves tried to remain above the fray, but they could not help being influenced by the growing partisanship of their followers. Each began to see the other through the lens of competition rather than the bond of brotherhood that had sustained them through every trial they had faced. When at last they crested the final ridge and looked down upon the 7 hills that would become the foundation of Rome, both brothers felt their breath catch in their throats. The landscape spread before them like a map drawn by the gods themselves, rolling hills covered with oak and olive trees, the silver ribbon of the Tiber winding through fertile plains, meadows that seemed to glow with their own inner light in the afternoon sun. But even as they gazed upon the site of their destiny, the twins found themselves disagreeing about which hill should serve as the center of their new city. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill, the tallest and most commanding of the 7, its slopes steep enough to provide natural defenses and its summit spacious enough to hold a great palace and temples worthy of the gods. Remus preferred the Aventine Hill, gentler and more accessible, a place where common citizens could feel welcome and where the city could grow organically rather than being imposed from above. Their followers gathered around them as they stood on the ridge, their faces eager with anticipation, but also marked by the growing divisions within their ranks. The argument that followed was civil in its language, but passionate in its intensity, each brother presenting his vision of what their city should become. The Palatine Hill offers security, Romulus argued, his voice carrying the authority of one born to command, a position from which we can watch for enemies and defend what we have built. A great city must first be a strong city, able to protect its people and expand its borders when opportunity arises. Remus shook his head, his expression troubled by his brother's emphasis on military considerations. "Strength without wisdom is mere brutality," he replied, his voice equally firm but touched with sadness at their disagreement. "A truly great city draws people not through fear of its armies but through love of its justice. The Aventine Hill offers openness, accessibility, a place where all can come to contribute their gifts to the common good." Unable to resolve their disagreement through argument, the twins decided to seek guidance from the gods through the ancient art of augury. They would each take position on their preferred hill and watch the sky for signs, waiting for the divine powers to indicate which location was truly blessed for the foundation of their city. The ritual began at dawn, with priests from both camps offering sacrifices and prayers, while the brothers took their positions on the Palatine and Aventine hills respectively. The morning air was crisp and clear, with visibility extending to the distant mountains, perfect conditions for reading the flight patterns of birds and other celestial omens. Remus, standing on the Aventine Hill surrounded by his most devoted followers, was the first to see a sign. 6 vultures appeared in the eastern sky, their great wings catching the early sunlight as they soared in stately formation across the heavens. A cheer went up from his supporters, for vultures were sacred to Mars, and their appearance was surely a sign of divine approval. But the celebration was short-lived, for shortly afterward, Romulus's watchers on the Palatine Hill began shouting and pointing toward the western sky. 12 vultures had appeared there, twice as many as had shown themselves to Remus, their flight even more majestic and purposeful than the first group. The supporters of Romulus erupted in triumphant cries, certain that their leader had received the stronger sign from heaven. What should have been a clear resolution to their disagreement instead became the source of even greater conflict. Remus's followers argued that their man had received the first sign, that priority in time should outweigh mere numbers in interpreting the god's will. Romulus's supporters countered that 12 vultures was obviously a more significant portent than 6, that the gods had waited to show the fuller extent of their favor. The twins themselves became caught up in the heated debate, their own disappointment and ambition overriding the wisdom they had shown throughout their lives. For the first time, they began to speak to each other, not as beloved brothers, but as rivals for a prize that could only belong to one. The sign was clear, Romulus declared, his voice harder than his followers had ever heard it. 12 vultures to your 6, the god's preference evident to anyone with eyes to see. The Palatine Hill is blessed for our enterprise, and I am chosen to lead it. Remus's response was equally firm, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by the iron determination of one who believes himself wronged. First in time, first in right, he replied, his words cutting through the morning air like a sword blade. The gods spoke to me before they spoke to you, and their initial choice cannot be undone by mere abundance of numbers. Despite their disagreement, or perhaps because of it, both brothers decided to proceed with the foundation of their respective cities. Romulus began the construction of his settlement on the Palatine Hill, marking out the boundaries with a sacred plough drawn by a white bull and a white cow, the furrow they carved serving as both physical and spiritual protection for the city that would rise within its bounds. The ceremony was magnificent in its ancient solemnity, with priests chanting prayers to Mars and Vesta while the sacred plough carved its way through the earth. Where the furrow would intersect with future gates, Romulus lifted the plough and carried it, ensuring that the sacred boundary remained unbroken except where it was meant to be breached. The earth that was turned up was carefully collected and offered to the gods, while the first stones of the foundation were laid with rituals that had been old when the world was young. But even as Romulus worked to establish his city on the Palatine, Remus began his own foundation ceremony on the Aventine Hill. His followers gathered around him, as he marked out a different set of boundaries, his own vision of what their city should become, taking shape in earthworks and stone foundations. The sight of two cities being founded simultaneously by brothers who had once been united in purpose and love filled the air with a sense of tragedy that seemed to weigh upon everyone present. This was not how their great enterprise was meant to unfold, not the glorious beginning that had been foretold by divine visions and prophetic dreams. As construction progressed on both hills, the rivalry between the brothers intensified into something darker and more dangerous. Their followers egged them on with partisan enthusiasm, each group determined to prove that their leader was building the superior settlement. What had begun as a difference of opinion about location and leadership was becoming a fundamental schism that threatened to destroy everything they had worked to achieve. The crisis came to a head when Remus, perhaps driven by frustration or a desire to prove a point about his brother's defenses, decided to test the strength of Romulus's walls. The fortifications that had been erected around the Palatine settlement were still low and incomplete, more symbolic than practical in their current state. "Behold the mighty walls of Rome," Remus called out mockingly as he approached his brother's construction site, his voice carrying clearly to workers on both hills. "See how easily they can be breached by any who choose to challenge them." With those words, he leapt over the low wall with athletic grace, landing inside his brother's sacred boundary with a gesture that was both physically effortless and symbolically devastating. The act was meant as mockery, a demonstration that Romulus's defenses were inadequate, but it was also a violation of the sacred space that had been consecrated with blood and prayers. Romulus, who had been supervising the placement of stones in the wall's foundation, spun around at his brother's mocking words. The sight of Remus standing within the sacred boundary, laughing at the fortifications that represented not just physical protection but spiritual integrity, sent a surge of rage through him unlike anything he had ever experienced. In that moment, all the frustration and disappointment of their recent conflicts, all the jealousy and ambition that had been building in his heart, crystallized into a fury that swept away years of brotherly love and shared purpose. He saw not his beloved twin, but a challenger to his authority, a mocker of his sacred work, an enemy who had violated the most fundamental laws of respect and honor. The tool in his hand, a heavy mason's hammer used for shaping stone, became a weapon before conscious thought could intervene. With a movement too quick for anyone to prevent, Romulus struck his brother with a blow that echoed across the hills like thunder, the sound seeming to shake the very foundations of the earth. Remus fell without a sound, his laughter cut short forever, his life flowing out onto the sacred soil that was meant to nourish the greatest city the world would ever know. The brother who had shared every triumph and trial, who had been half of a perfect whole, lay still and silent while his blood soaked into the earth that would become Rome. The silence that followed seemed to last for eternity, though it was probably only seconds before the full horror of what had happened crashed down upon everyone present. Romulus stood frozen, the hammer still in his hand, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror as he stared at his brother's still form. "What have I done?" he whispered, the words barely audible but carrying such weight of anguish that they seemed to press down upon everyone who heard them. The rage that had consumed him just moments before was already fading, replaced by a grief so vast and terrible that it threatened to crush his very soul. He dropped to his knees beside his fallen brother, his hands trembling as he touched the face that was so like his own, the eyes that had looked upon him with love and trust through all the years of their shared life. "Remus," he called out, his voice breaking with desperation. "Forgive me, brother. I did not mean. The rage took me. The gods help me. What have I done?" But there was no forgiveness to be had, for the dead cannot speak, and Remus had passed beyond the reach of mortal words or mortal regret. The brother who had been Romulus's other half, his constant companion and beloved rival, lay silent under the morning sky, while his life's blood stained the earth that was meant to be blessed with joy and triumph. The followers of both brothers stood in stunned silence, their partisan enthusiasm silenced by the magnitude of the tragedy that had unfolded before their eyes. Those who had supported Remus looked upon Romulus with expressions of horror and accusation, while his own followers seemed unsure whether to comfort their leader or condemn him for his terrible act. Slowly, with movements that seemed to age him years in moments, Romulus rose to his feet and turned to face the assembled crowd. His face was streaked with tears that fell like rain after drought, and his voice, when he finally found it, was hollow with grief and self-recrimination. "Hear me, all you who would be Romans," he said, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat like pieces of his soul. "Let this be the first and greatest law of the city we are founding, that no one, no matter who they are or what they have done, shall ever again cross these sacred walls in mockery or contempt. Let the fate of my beloved brother serve as warning to all who would challenge the sanctity of Rome." It was a decree born of grief rather than wisdom, an attempt to give meaning to a meaningless tragedy, but it became the foundation stone upon which the Roman character would be built. The city that rose from this moment of terrible loss would be marked forever by the blood of fratricide, its greatness forever shadowed by the knowledge that it had been born from the destruction of the most sacred bonds of love and kinship. The funeral of Remus became the first great ceremony of the city that would be called Rome, a ritual of mourning and remembrance that established many of the customs that would define Roman culture for centuries to come. His body was prepared with all the honors due to a prince and hero, dressed in robes of purple and gold, his weapons placed beside him as if he were merely sleeping and might wake at any moment to continue his great work. Romulus himself presided over the ceremonies, his grief so visible and profound that even those who had opposed him began to soften their anger. He spoke of his brother's courage and wisdom, of their shared childhood in the sacred grove, of the dreams they had harbored together for the city they would build. His voice broke again and again as he tried to find words adequate to express the magnitude of his loss and the depth of his remorse. "He was the better half of my soul," Romulus said as the funeral pyre was lit, the flames reaching toward the sky like prayers given physical form. "In him lived all that was gentle and wise and compassionate in our shared nature. What I have destroyed in a moment of madness can never be replaced, and the city we build will be forever poorer for his absence." The smoke from the pyre rose straight up into the still air, carrying with it the essence of a hero whose potential would never be fully realized, whose gentleness and wisdom had been lost to the world in a single moment of fraternal rage. As the flames consumed Remus's mortal form, those who watched felt that they were witnessing not just the death of a man, but the end of an age of innocence and possibility. In the days that followed the funeral, as work resumed on the construction of Rome, Romulus found himself bearing a burden heavier than any crown. He was king now of the settlement on the Palatine Hill, undisputed leader of the enterprise that would become the greatest city in the world. But the victory felt hollow and poisoned by the knowledge of how it had been achieved. The followers of Remus, after much discussion and soul-searching, chose to remain and help build the city rather than scatter to their original homes. They recognized that their leader would have wanted his vision to live on, even if he could not be there to guide its implementation. Their presence served as both comfort and constant reminder to Romulus of what his moment of rage had cost. Each day brought new decisions to be made, new challenges to be faced, new opportunities to shape the character of the growing city. But for every choice he made, Romulus found himself wondering what his brother would have done, what wisdom Remus might have offered, what gentler path might have been possible. The solitude of command was made more bitter by the knowledge that he had chosen it through violence rather than earning it through merit. Yet Rome continued to grow, drawing settlers from across the region who were attracted by the stories of the wolf-born king and the city blessed by Mars. The walls rose higher and stronger, the temples grew more magnificent, the population swelled with farmers and craftsmen and traders who saw opportunity in the new settlement. What had begun as a dream shared by two brothers was becoming a reality shaped by one man's determination to honor both their memory and their destiny. On the anniversary of Remus's death, as Romulus knelt alone in the temple of Mars that stood at the heart of his growing city, his divine father appeared to him in a vision that would shape the remainder of his mortal life. The god's presence filled a sacred space with light that seemed to come from within the very stones themselves, and his voice carried the weight of eternity when he spoke. "My son," Mars said, his tone neither condemning nor approving, but simply acknowledging the terrible complexity of mortal choice and divine destiny. "You have built well upon the foundation of tragedy. Rome will indeed become the greatest city the world has ever known. Its eagles will fly over lands that have not yet been discovered. Its laws will govern peoples not yet born. But know this, the blood of your brother will forever be mixed with the mortar of its walls, and the city's greatness will always be shadowed by the memory of what was lost to achieve it. The tears you have shed in remorse, the wisdom you have gained through suffering, these have not been wasted," the god continued, his divine radiance softening with something that might have been paternal compassion. "But neither can they undo what was done in anger. You will rule long and well. You will see Rome grow from a single hill to master of the world, but you will carry the weight of fratricide until the day you join your brother in the realm beyond mortal care." As the vision faded and Romulus was left alone once more in the temple, he understood finally that his destiny was not to be the perfect hero of legend, but something more complex and human, a figure who embodied both the potential for greatness and the capacity for terrible mistakes that lived within every mortal soul. Rome would be great precisely because it was built upon the acknowledgement of human flaws as much as human virtues, a city that could face the darkness within itself and still choose to strive for light. The years that followed saw the fulfillment of every prophecy about Rome's greatness. The city spread beyond its original boundaries to encompass all 7 hills. Its population grew to hundreds of thousands. Its armies conquered lands from Britain to the Euphrates. The name of Rome became synonymous with civilization itself, while Roman law and Roman engineering shaped the world for centuries to come. But in the heart of the eternal city, in the temple where Romulus had received his father's final message, there stood always a smaller shrine dedicated to the memory of Remus. No grand statues or elaborate ceremonies marked this quiet space, just a simple altar where the founding king would come each year to remember the brother whose death had made Rome possible and whose gentleness had been sacrificed to its greatness. And so the story of Romulus and Remus became not just the founding myth of the greatest city in history, but an eternal reminder that even the most glorious achievements can be built upon the foundation of profound loss, that greatness often demands sacrifices that can never be fully justified, and that the price of power is sometimes the very thing that makes power worth having. As you drift toward sleep tonight, carry with you this ancient wisdom that within each of us lives both the potential for creation and destruction, for love and rage, for building up and tearing down. The choice between these possibilities is made new each day, and the measure of our lives is not whether we avoid all mistakes, but whether we can learn from them and build something beautiful upon the ruins of our failures. Sleep well and dream of the eternal city that rose from the ashes of brotherly love, forever great and forever haunted by what it cost to achieve that greatness. And so ends our journey through the mists of ancient time, back to the age when gods walked among mortals and the very stones of the earth were witness to miracles. The story of Romulus and Remus echoes still through the halls of memory, a tale as eternal as the city they founded, as timeless as the human heart that beats within us all. Close your eyes now, dear dreamer, and let the gentle rhythm of this ancient story carry you into the realm of peaceful sleep. Feel the silver presence of Lupa watching over you with the same protective love she showed the divine twins. Hear the whisper of the Tiber's waters carrying you toward dreams of your own destined greatness. In your sleep tonight, perhaps you too will walk through sacred groves where wolves sing lullabies to the stars, where every sunrise brings new possibilities for heroes to be born. The wolf-born kings sleep now in the halls of legend, but their story lives on in every heart that beats with courage, every hand that builds rather than destroys, every soul that chooses love over fear even in the face of loss. Rest well, and know that you too carry within you the spark of divine fire, the potential for greatness that needs only wisdom and love to kindle it into blazing life. Sweet dreams, gentle dreamer. May the eternal city of your own making rise golden and beautiful in the landscape of your slumber.